Welcome to Aging Insight with your host, John Ross and Lisa Scholmeyer. This program is made possible by
Welcome to Aging Insight. I'm Lisa Scholmeyer and I'm here with John Ross, and we are elder law attorneys based here in the Arklatex area. You know, elder law attorneys deal with lots of different areas of the law, but we typically serve a client who perhaps is retired, near retirement, hoping to retire someday. And so, you know, we actually assist a lot of people just really across the age spectrum, and we also assist families who may be caring for a senior or disabled person, because there are lots of areas of the law that can impact that senior or disabled person, and you just don't want to mess up. So the program of Aging Insight is here to give you information so that you'll know what questions to ask and what to look out for as maybe you journey on in life, or you're helping a friend or family member on that journey. So welcome to Aging Insight.
Well, and you know, a lot of times as you go through this process, especially more commonly at least towards those later years, a lot of times people start thinking about the end of life, and they start thinking about their own funeral. Things that they would want, things that they wouldn't want. Some people just don't care at all.
Right.
Some people, on the other hand, care about every detail. One of my grandmothers meticulously picked out exactly how she wanted, down to the songs and the order those songs were to be played, certain Bible verses that were to be read. And just step by step, she knew exactly how she wanted it, and that was something that was important to her. The issue you run into with all of this is, you know, kind of two sides. One, how do you make sure that whatever you want related to that funeral happens? But then the other question becomes, well, how, or really more importantly, when do you pay for it?
Right.
Because that funeral is an expensive proposition. Even a very simple funeral, maybe something that involves a cremation, very limited, if any, services, that we're still talking about a couple of $1,000.
Right, we are. So, you know, that is a service that we will all need at some point or another. And there is a large range of pricing for those services. And John, you know, that $2,000 about for that cremation type circumstances, and then on up to $10,000 plus for what you may think of as a more traditional funeral service and burial.
Yeah, where you have a visitation, then you have a ceremony in a chapel, and you have a graveside service, and there's flowers, and there's music, and there's limousine rides to the graveside, and all of those sort of things. Yeah, it's very easy to spend. In fact, I think the average is somewhere around $6,000, but it's not uncommon for us to have seen clients who have spent $8, $10, or even $12,000 to $14,000 on a single funeral. And so that oftentimes can be one of the largest expenses that a person will make their whole life, outside of maybe their home or a car.
Yeah. So if you haven't guessed today, we're going to talk about, you know, some of these issues that come up with funerals. But, you know, John, on that same thing, I always say, you know, for most of us, a funeral is the most expensive party that will ever be held in our honor, and we won't be there to enjoy it.
That's exactly right. And you know, so the you know, one of the big things is, and this is a question that people ask me all the time, is, well, John, should I go ahead and prepay for that funeral? Should I go ahead and make sure that that cost is taken care of? And I will say that as elder law attorneys, Lisa and I probably encourage more people to prepay for funerals than just about anybody else. We probably encourage more people to prepay for funerals than the funeral homes.
We might.
But that is often because we are doing it for a very specific purpose. Under the Medicaid rules, if you're trying to qualify for, say, nursing home Medicaid, or maybe you're trying to qualify for SSI because you're a disabled person who doesn't have access to traditional Social Security, and so you can qualify for SSI. But under most of these need-based government benefit programs, there are only a few assets that they will let you have. You can typically have a home, you can typically have a car, some small items of personal property, but one of the others that you can typically have is a prepaid, irrevocable burial contract. And so, Lisa, I mean, how many times have you talked to somebody who has a family member that's going into a nursing home? They have a house, they have a car, they have a little bit of personal property, and they've got $10,000 or $15,000.
And that's the only thing that is stopping them from qualifying for assistance with that nursing home cost.
Exactly. And so oftentimes our recommendation would be, well, look, why don't you take some of those excess funds and use them for a funeral. I spoke with a gentleman yesterday. He's at an assisted living. He qualified for Social Security disability benefits, but those benefits are pretty low. And he's been on Medicaid for many years. Well, it took about 2 or 3 years to get that Social Security. And when he finally got it, guess what? They gave him some back pay.
Okay.
And that back pay wasn't a lot. It was maybe $10,000 or $15,000, but that back pay was enough for him to risk losing his Medicaid. And it was a very simple solution from my standpoint. I said, well, look, have you taken care of your funeral? He said, no. I said, look, go pay for your funeral. And once you have that prepaid contract, the money you have spent will not count towards your Medicaid. So we actually recommend those prepaid funerals under these circumstances,
right,
pretty regular. The question is, if you're not doing it for the specific purpose of reducing your assets for Medicaid, are those prepaid contracts still a good idea? And that answer can be a little maybe, maybe not.
Right. So, well, I guess we'll take our first break and we'll come back and kind of dig into the particulars of purchasing that prepaid funeral plan and contract. So stick with us.
Hi there, I'm Larry Sims. It's been my privilege for the past several years to be a volunteer board member of Hospice of Texarkana, and there I'm able to represent community members like you. We continually customize our end-of-life care to better meet the needs of our community. As an example, our medical director and nurse practitioners still make visits to homes and facilities. Call today to learn more about the help we can give your family. Hospice of Texarkana, the nonprofit hospice established in 1985 for the community, by the community.
I'm so glad we found the Wadley Senior Clinic. Their team specializes in caring for older adults, and their doctors listen and work with me to keep me healthy and independent. With monthly educational programs, x-ray and lab, and state-of-the-art exam rooms, I get expert care and understanding about what I'm going through. Best yet, they're easy to get to right off the interstate at Jefferson. See what Wadley Senior Clinic could do for you. Wadley Senior Clinic, where healthy relationships begin.
Welcome back to Aging Insight. I'm John Ross here with Lisa Scholmeyer, and you're watching Aging Insight, where today we are talking about, at least initially, we're talking about whether or not you should purchase a prepaid burial contract. And, these can be kind of tricky. We talked about, there are some very specific reasons why you might do that if you're talking about, for example, using that money for the funeral in lieu of having to spend it at a nursing home prior to qualifying for Medicaid. Mm-hmm. But if we're taking it out of that scenario and we're just talking about the average everyday Joe, should you prepay for that funeral? Well, maybe, maybe not. You got a couple of things to consider in all of this. First of all, the people that prepay for the funerals, there are a large number of people across the country every year who the money that they have prepaid for their funeral somehow gets lost or squandered. For example, maybe they prepaid at a certain funeral home that went out of business, and now there's nobody there to take care of that funeral, and there's no records. There's people that maybe they prepaid at one place, but then they moved. And maybe they moved a long way away and completely forgot that they had prepaid it, or maybe never told anybody. And so when they die in this new location, the family ends up paying for another burial someplace else. So there's lots of times where people end up losing money in these prepaid contracts. Now, that in and of itself, what we're talking about is prepaying for it. Now, that's a different question as to whether or not you should pre-plan for it.
Right. Of course, pre-planning is simply getting very specific about, the actual, implements, whatever, caskets, service, flowers, acknowledgement cards, obituary notices, visitation times, all of those details. You can certainly pre-plan a funeral, and I'm sure that any facility will allow you to look at that and do that. But the question is then, once you've pre-planned, do you go ahead and pay? And John, a lot of contracts are for the actual services and caskets you've picked out, and various things that you've done on pre-plan. But there's also another aspect to the pre-planning and prepaying for your funeral, and many facilities offer essentially it's a small life insurance policy that you're actually making a one-time premium payment on that life insurance policy, and based on your pre-planning and the cost of all of your choices on your pre-planning and your age. They anticipate that by having your money from the time you make that premium payment, that there will be enough interest earned and enough time invested in that money that by the time you died, that your services that you've selected, that the money will essentially pay for those services.
And this is probably one of the biggest selling points related to prepaid funeral, is that the typical funeral home contract essentially allows you to pick out what it is that you want based on the prices today. And then you you pay for those services either by paying the full amount or by buying a life insurance policy for a smaller amount that would have a death benefit equal to whatever the full amount is. So maybe you pick out $10,000 worth of goods and services for that funeral. You spend $6,000 for a life insurance policy that has a $10,000 death benefit. But either way, you're essentially giving that money over to the funeral home, or but the idea is you're buying it on today's prices.
Right.
And so if there's many years go by and the cost of a funeral has increased over time, kind of the selling point there is, you paid for it, but you locked those prices in way back when, which, under the right circumstances, and again, I'll use my own grandmother for an example, she knew which church was going to have the service. She knew which funeral home was going to do it, and it was the funeral home that had been in that town for 3 generations. They were the only funeral home in town, very well established, very successful funeral home, not a lot of risk that they would go out of business. Mm-hmm. She knew where she wanted to be buried, had the grave already picked out. And so in her circumstances, knowing exactly what she wanted, knowing that those decisions were not going to change over time,
yes.
It made pretty good sense for her to go ahead and pay for those and lock them in at the current rate, so that when she dies 10 or 15 or 20 years later, she paid a lot less for that funeral than what it would have ultimately cost had she waited until the end. So that's kind of the selling point on that. But there's kind of some other things to think about, because the reason they can do that is because your money could be growing over time.
That's right. I mean, essentially, in that circumstance, the insurance policy you've purchased through the funeral home or whatnot, they're investing in the market, and they are hoping that that money grows such to cover your chosen expenses later on. But, in that particular case, we now have a third party, a funeral home or life insurance company related, does business with that funeral home, that has your money, and you don't have access and use of it while you're living. So that's
with that in mind, if you could, for example, take that same $6,000 or $8,000 and just put it in some mutual funds or an interest-bearing account of some kind, and assuming you didn't touch it, just like you would prepaying, that would grow over time. And it's very possible that by the time you did die, that $6,000 or $8,000 has grown to significantly more than even what that present day cost of the funeral would have been. Yeah. So financially speaking, while you can see one good side of locking in the prices today, but you're also giving up the interest and dividends and things you could have been earning on that same dollar.
Well, and one of my clients one time said to me, we had the same discussion, and he said, but you know what, if I go ahead and buy something through the funeral home, and I understand it's a life insurance policy and I've done my pre-planning, I know those darn kids aren't going to take the money and run. My service and my funeral actually is going to happen, as opposed to the money market, which, hey, maybe the kids, do a much lesser service or burial circumstance and take the money and run.
Yeah, and I did in preparing for this program. I saw where somebody had made a recommendation of, why don't you just go get your own insurance policy, or just put that money in a CD and then name a child as a beneficiary, and that way you're in control of your money. You might even get a better rate of return. And it's still, when you die, it goes to that child who can then use that money for the funeral. And that's all fine and dandy, but it makes a few pretty dangerous assumptions in there. One, that they will use it. Mm-hmm. Two, that they're still alive.
True.
Or not incapacitated themselves. Or if they might have been in some other financial problem, maybe that child has filed bankruptcy, the life insurance money goes to them, the bankruptcy court takes it. Yeah. And then there's no money for the funeral. So again, you've got to kind of look at your family and know the situation and all of that. So pre-planning can be, or prepaying can be a good idea. Pre-planning is always a good idea. And there's a couple of different ways to do that, but we're going to cover that here in the next section. So stick around. We'll be right back.
The Wadley Senior Clinic has been such a blessing for our family. Because they specialize in geriatric care, they take the time to really focus on Dad's needs. Their exam rooms are specially designed for seniors, and they offer lab and x-ray on site. With monthly educational programs on health and wellness of the mind and body, our healthcare questions get answered. Best of all, they accept Dad's Medicare benefits. See what the Wadley Senior Clinic can do for you. Wadley Senior Clinic, where healthy relationships begin.
Hi there, I'm Larry Sims. It's been my privilege for the past several years to be a volunteer board member of Hospice of Texarkana, and there I'm able to represent community members like you. We continually customize our end-of-life care to better meet the needs of our community. As an example, our medical director and nurse practitioner still make visits to homes and facilities. Call today to learn more about the help we can give your family. Hospice of Texarkana, the nonprofit hospice established in 1985 for the community, by the community.
Welcome back to Aging Insight. I'm Lisa Scholmeyer. I'm here with John Ross, and today we're talking about, maybe the most expensive party you ever have for yourself, but you're not around to enjoy it, and that is the funeral. And we've talked about pre-planning versus prepayment. And, prepaying, John, based on what we've been talking about, that's going to be a very case-by-case decision.
Right. If you're doing it for a specific reason like qualifying for Medicaid, no problem. If you're not doing it for that specific reason, then you need to be able to, you need to be very sure that the funeral home will continue to be in business, that what you want will not change over time. And so if you're very particular and what you know about your funeral will not change, then it may be appropriate to prepay it. But even if you don't prepay it, you can still accomplish a lot of those same things by just pre-planning.
Right, and a lot of times, in a lot of communities, there may only be one funeral home, funeral services available. And many people, they have not priced such goods and services unless they've ever had to be involved with the death of a family member. And a lot of times, that's a highly emotional time. This is a time when sometimes the grief and maybe prior family conflict kind of rises to the top when there is a death of a loved one. So pre-planning is a great way to avoid all of that. But the other thing about pre-planning is, since you're not in an emotional state, you can actually make some more savvy business decisions about you and your money. And even if you don't prepay, at least kind of know what the services generally are likely to cost. If you ask a funeral home, they are required to provide to you an itemized price list. And you can ask on the phone, you can ask in person, but under the Funeral Home Act of 1984, funeral homes must be forthcoming and transparent with all of their costs and associated fees. So, if you're pre-planning, you can get that cost list.
Right, and maybe you have certain things that you want, certain things that you don't want. Maybe you're just a price-sensitive person. Mm-hmm. And if that's who you are, figuring some of those things out and saying, this is the kind of thing that I would want, this is not the kind of thing that I would want, that's going to help those family members following your death be able to make good decisions, either good financial decisions, keeping within what you considered a reasonable budget for such a service, and also making sure that if there were specific things that you wanted, that they get carried out. So even in a perfect family situation where everybody is working together, having these things pre-planned a bit, not necessarily prepaid, but pre-planned, can help alleviate the stress, and it can certainly save some money along the way, because nobody is in a good mental position to be making financial decisions right after someone's death. Oftentimes they might feel guilty if they're not spending the absolute most, like somehow they're not honoring your memory if they don't get the fanciest casket or the biggest bouquet or whatever it happens to be. So if you've lined those sort of things out on the front end, that can be great and beneficial even for a family that gets along wonderfully. For the ones that don't get along wonderfully, this sort of thing can be a lifesaver. Yes. Recently visited with a woman who was dying of terminal cancer, and she knew that what her wishes were related to her burial would probably not be voluntarily carried out by the people who were the most closest family members. And she was worried that, she wanted to be cremated. She wanted her ashes taken back to her home state of Minnesota. She wanted those buried with her parents. And yet she had other family members in our area that she knew would think differently.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And she wouldn't be there to fight.
Right.
And so for her, we actually did something which is perfectly permitted. It's provided in the law, and this is what's called a designation of burial agent. And this is where you can appoint a person who will be in charge of your remains following your death. And so you can nominate a person, and if you've nominated that person, they have priority over anybody else as it relates to your funeral, the disposition of your body, the disposition of your remains, all of those sort of things. And in that same document, you can tell them what to do.
That's right. You can give them the details, and it's all, literally, it's all signed, notarized, official.
Yeah.
This is a document that someone would keep with their important papers. And if there's if there's already a chosen funeral services provider that'll be involved, then you certainly want to get a copy of that designation of burial agent to that funeral provider, so that way should someone else show up to make your plans, that they'll already have that on file. And that, of course, hopefully, is you've done a little pre-planning while you've given them that designation, so there's already some record at the funeral provider of where you were going with those plans.
Yeah, and Lisa and I have both fought these battles in court when this sort of planning was not in place. So knowing that, for example, with this same lady, we did do the designation of burial agent. She did pass away, and just as she suspected, these other family members stepped in and attempted to counter the plans that she had laid out by saying that they were the closest family members and therefore they had authority. But once that designation of burial agent hit the funeral home instantly knew what their responsibility was and who was in charge. And having that one piece of paper in place prior probably saved everybody involved hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in legal fees,
Right.
trying to fight over this issue.
Right. Yeah. Once you get to the courthouse, everybody has lost by that point.
That's exactly right. So, pre-plan your funeral, maybe consider doing a designation of burial agent, but you don't necessarily have to prepay for it unless you've done so knowing all of the potential ramifications. So, good information, and that's the kind of information you get here on Aging Insight. Hope you'll stick around next week and catch another episode. But until then, we'll see you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this week's Aging Insight program with John Ross and Lisa Scholmeyer. This program is made possible by